Welcome to the Boaters Podcast. We have a question from Dr. Ed. He says, I only have 3 inboards, 2 in my cruisers and 1 in my Baja. They have plenty of their own problems too. Maintenance is everything on a boat. You must run them every few weeks and so much more. I get roughly about 20 years out of my engines. I don't know why outboards became so popular though. This is a great question, great topic, Dr. Ed. We appreciate you liking, commenting, and subscribing. This is the Boaters Podcast. We are all about talking about boats, outboards, engines, everything that has to do with a boat. We are brought to you by our school community, which has an option for you to learn tons of skills about your boat, as well as connect with other boaters and talk about everything boating. You can check that out by using the link in the description, as well as the link in the comment section. Now, for the outboard question and why outboards became so popular, it might even be like a little bit of a history thing because 30, 40 years ago, two-stroke outboards and other outboards, they did not get near the same amount of time that you would out of your inboards. Inboards were so much more popular for a very, very long time in the boating world, especially up north. I mean, South Florida kind of has its own kick to the whole story because it is completely different water, completely different environment, way rougher. But by and large, the inboards pretty much ran the boating world for a very, very long time. There was very few people that wanted outboards just because of reliability issues and other things like that. And then also just everybody was so used to working on their own stuff. The inboards are basically like a car engine in your boat, and it made it, that's just the way it was. You know, I mean, there wasn't like it just the way it was. And because the outboards were not as reliable and they had all kinds of problems and they constantly needed to be rebuilt and have things done to them, they were just not as popular. But I would say somewhere around the 80s, 90s, when they started to kind of dial in and make them more reliable. And then once you hit the 2000s, they were very reliable. But during the 80s and the 90s, convenience came into play. Having the engine on the outside of the boat and being able to trim it all the way up out of the water and not have to do with the growth and all of the other things that go on with having an inboard or stern drive or something that your drive can never come out of the water. It's constantly in the water. It's stuck there. It's never coming out. You can't trim it up. Whereas your engine, your outboard engine, it's a lot smaller and it's on the back. You can access it all the way around. And when you're in the water, you can trim it all the way up out of the water. So massive, massive convenience there. And then when they started to become more reliable in the early 2000s and people were getting a few thousand hours out of their outboards, it almost became a no-brainer because everybody wanted to work on the outboard. No one wanted to work on the inboard because the inboards, they're just a pain to work on in really tight spaces, and it's just, they don't do so well in saltwater environments like South Florida, where the saltwater just eats everything up. Every other year, you're spending tons of money redoing your manifolds, redoing your risers, having to flush them by using a ridline flush and do all kinds of things to keep them running. They were just much more of a hassle than an outboard is, and that's, you know, about that time when the outboards became more reliable. I'm saying I would guess somewhere in the 80s and the 90s, early 2000s when they started having reliable 300s. Now all of a sudden you've got the horsepower that can move your 21s, your 23s, your 25s, 24s, like the perfect boat for most people. And it was just so much better. It also gave you so much more space inside of the boat. Now all of a sudden you have all this room inside the boat where before you would have a cover covering your engine because the engine was in the middle or the back of the boat. Obviously, if you're in a sport fish boat or you're in a bigger boat where the engines are under the deck, it's not really that much of a difference. But for the 18, the 19, the 21, the 23, to have an inboard in those boats, that engine is taking up a lot of space in the back of the boat. You know, your cockpit, the stern, all that area is being consumed by the engine that's sitting there in the middle of your boat. Whereas with the outboard, your engine's now on the outside of the boat, all the way in the back, freeing up all that room inside the boat, which massive convenience. So why they became more popular, I think it has to do with convenience, and then also the price, which now all of a sudden, outboards are costing 30, 40, 50, $100,000. So, I don't know if price is really in that discussion anymore. There might be a flip there where an inboard is actually way cheaper than an outboard these days, but there for a while that wasn't the case. So I'm thinking convenience is probably the number one reason. I think just the convenience to work on them, to trim them out of the water, to free up space inside of your boat. Everything that has to do with that makes them why they became so popular. I don't know. You guys let me know if you can come up with another reason outside of that. I think that covers a pretty good, gamut of the popularity of an outboard. Oh, and also the reliability. Now that they're more reliable, I think that throws it in there too. Next question. Jason Winder says, I am a commercial fisherman. We go through motors constantly. I bought a brand new Suzuki 250 and I only got 2 years before the motor blew up. I find a discussion about hours very interesting. I've had some motors go to 8,000 hours and the Suzuki only went to 3,000, but we use these motors 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. What is your opinion about commercial fishing and outboards because they only give us 1 year of warranty? Commercial is completely different. Like you said, you guys are putting on so much time on the engines. Just doing the math at that, you're talking 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. That is 48 hours a week. So you're putting on 192 hours per month. And then, per year, you're putting on 2,300 hours a year, give or take. Obviously, that could be some more, that could be some less. It could be 1,900 hours one year and 2,600 hours another year. So yeah, when you're putting that amount of time on them, if you were to break it down for the cost of maintenance, so what everything that I'm talking about now is going to be for a commercial fisherman, someone that is putting this amount of time on an outboard. This is not for you that is only putting on a couple hundred hours on your engine per year. The information is going to be totally different, but I think you'll understand as I talk through this situation. So at 2,300 hours per year, on an engine, yeah, if you only got 3,000 out of the one engine, that's 2 years and the thing blew up. That's not good. But at 2,300, if you divide that by 100, that's 23 oil changes in that year. Now, on top of the oil changes at 23 that had to be done, you're also going to have 7 300-hour oil changes, which is basically 3 impellers, spark plugs, anodes, all of that stuff. So because of just working the numbers, let's say it costs you $600 to do the oil change, and then let's say $1,500 to do the 300-hour service. Obviously, if you're paying someone to do it, 7 of those 300 hours, that's cost you $11,000, and then plus the other 600 oil changes or $600 oil changes, 100-hour services, so $9,600. So we're talking $20,000 to $22,000 just in service costs for one engine. Let's say it's a 300 because that's, I'm just a Suzuki 250. The numbers are going to be very similar if you're running the recommended 100-hour oil change and 300-hour impeller change. The reason I brought all that up is that if you are a commercial fisherman and let's say you make $100,000 just to make the math easy. At $100,000 a year, you take out all of your fuel expenses and all your maintenance costs. That maintenance cost at $22,000, that brings you down to making $78,000. Then you got to pay Uncle Sam, pay your taxes. Let's say you pay $8,000 on that. That takes you down to $70,000, and then you put in your fuel costs and all the other stuff, towing the boat there and everything else that goes into it. You're spending a lot of money. So obviously, in order to make it more worth continuing to be a commercial fisherman, and running charters and such, you're going to want to save as much as you can. And obviously spending $22,000 a year on oil changes ain't cutting it. So what I would say for you, my thoughts on something like this, and what we see a lot of charter captains do, a lot of commercial fishermen, a lot of people that run this amount of time on their boats, you will be selective in what you do, and you will find your own maintenance routine to extend as much time as you can, because there's some things that you can push down the road and some things that you cannot push down the road. So I've seen people that do 200 plus hours before they do an oil change, which is not good. I mean, that's why you only get 3,000 hours out of the engine, is the thing pops because of dirty, old, low oil. I mean, that's mechanical failure. The engine's going to blow up. But other things you can push down the road. I mean, anodes, fuel filters, spark plugs, accessory belts to drive your alternator, impellers. Some of that stuff you can kick the can down the road. It doesn't have to be every 300 hours and every 100 hours. So your oil changes, your gear lube, and the oil filters, yeah, I would not be skipping on that. I'd be doing those every 100 hours. But the other stuff you can kind of kick down the road, because if you're dropping your lower unit and doing the impeller 7 times a year, if you only drop that lower unit and did the impeller, let's say twice a year, and got that much more time out of the impeller, obviously the impeller wears out, and you'll be able to see your pressures on your engine. Most of them have block water pressure sensors on them now, so you'll be able to see what your water pressure is and to know when your impeller is starting to go out. Before you break a blade, you're generally not going to break a blade off of an impeller just because you're running it so much that it's not like the thing's getting hot. It's just losing its rubber moldability and the amount of pressure that the thing can make. So I would be trying to stretch the impellers, and then also the accessory drive belts, your anodes. There's no reason, unless you have corrosion issues, to have to change your anodes 7 times a year. Unless you're in a really bad spot and you've got other issues that are eating those anodes out. Those anodes, for the most part, you're going to be able to stretch those out and be, let's say you get 400, 500, 600 hours out of the anodes before you have to change them. Stretching that stuff out. Thermostats, those are going to be hit or miss, whether or not you're going to be able to stretch. Normally you do 300 hours on a thermostat, but again, you're putting 300 hours on in 6 weeks. So in 6 weeks, you're putting on 300 hours. So is that enough time and enough water and enough air to corrode and destroy your thermostat in 6 weeks? Maybe, maybe not. If you get 8 weeks, 10 weeks out of the thermostat before it starts to give you problems, and again, you can see the temperatures on your gauge, you can see your water pressures on the gauge. So you can probably stretch your thermostats out, as well as spark plugs. Generally, you can't stretch spark plugs too long. 300 hours is pretty good. You can get 400, 450, maybe 500. As soon as you get to that's 500 is kind of really stretching it. You don't want to stretch the spark plugs too long, because that can cause other issues. But that's what I'm thinking as far as like just a discussion on, for one, making the engine last longer, and for two, not having to spend that much money trying to get the engine to continue to last a long time, when the amount of time that you're putting on these engines that quick, or on these components, same thing as your fuel filters, your water separators. As long as you don't have water in your fuel, if you take that water separator, it's just filtering your fuel. As long as you're running good, clean fuel, you're not, running trash through your engine, you're going to be able to stretch that water separator and your fuel filters out a little while. They do break down over time, but again, it's just a paper element that's in there. If you are putting, if you're not changing those but every 3 months, that's going to be how many 100-hour changes? That's, 300, 400, 500 hours on your fuel filter. Obviously, if you have dirty fuel and getting crap fuel, that's another issue. You're going to need to change them sooner than that. But if you can do them every other oil change, that's going to save you a lot of money. And again, you're putting time on like that. It's not like it's going a year or so. So anything else that I could think of that would be able to stretch it out? The oil and the gear lube, that's a non-discussion though. Like there's no getting around that. I would do the engine oil and the oil filter and the gear lube every 100 hours, because if you burn oil, which does happen over time, especially when you're running that much, you don't want to run low on oil, and then the oil gets dirty. So after 100 hours, 150, 200 hours, I know it's just another week, but another week is kind of like it's rough on all the oil changes. But you don't want that. The dirty oil is going to wear out mechanically the engine. It's not good. So I would not be skipping on those. Whether you do it at 100 on the dot or 120, 130, because again, we're talking about from 100 to 120, 130, that's only 2-3 days. So you kind of have to work that in your schedule. It's the staying away from the 200, 250 before you change that oil. That's what I would be mainly concerned about. What else you're asking about? Other than that, the oil changes are going to make them last longer. And the gear lube, there's no warning on a lower unit. When a seal goes bad on a lower unit, it goes bad. Like, it's not like, there's any kind of buzzer. You just start losing gear lube, you start sucking in water, and the next thing you know, the lower unit blows up. So I'd be doing the gear lube every 100 hours, but if you stretch an impeller to 400, 500, 600 hours, you don't have to drop the lower unit. And if you're doing I would also do all the maintenance yourself. Keep logs and do it all yourself. So that way, if you trailer the boat, you can do it, you'll get very, very proficient at doing this. So I would definitely be doing your own maintenance and not paying someone, because those oil changes go from $600 paying someone to do it to only $100, $150 in oil and a filter. But you let me know what you do as far as trying to run that whole gamut of trying to save money over here, but trying to still get the engine, protect the engine, but also stay in business. It's not like, you can just shut down the boat every other week to do service on it and not be out running the boat. You're running a business. So kind of a catch-22. But Christian Clark, so what's the difference between clean power, red and black, and battery power, solid red? So clean power on basically all your digital engines now is just clean power for the computers in the system. It goes straight to the battery, it's fused, and it is just straight clean power because it comes straight from the battery and lets your engine computers have power to them constantly without a battery switch in between. So whenever you turn your key switch on, that computer has power there. It's not connected to the rest of the system. Your battery power goes to running everything else, meaning your trim, your injectors, your spark plugs, your fuel pumps, the relays, like all that stuff uses the battery voltage, whereas clean power is coming straight from the battery and isn't on that same circuit with all that other stuff. That's all clean power is. Victor Frankenstein, bunk or rollers, which is better? That's totally personal preference, Victor. Me personally, I like bunks. I mean, I like bunks better than rollers. There's no rhyme or reason there. I mean, some people like rollers. Some locations do better with rollers. I really don't think that there is a clean one is better than the other. Totally personal preference. Some have maybe an application to them, like say what your boat's made out of, whether it be fiberglass, aluminum, metal, ropaline, like, that might play a little bit of a factor into it. But, like the ropaline, I think the plastic boats, because depending on where you are, when it gets hot out, they do warp over the years. So if you're on a roller trailer with a ropaline boat, it might mess up the hull and put indentions on there. So, something like that might play a factor. But by and large, I don't think that there is a real reason why one would be better than another. I like bunks, but that's personal preference. I don't think there's one being better than another. Kale says gel coat or flow coat. Do you know the difference? I'm not a gel coat expert, but gel coat, flow coat is, I would say, is like I would be considered a type of gel coat. Like flow coat would be a type of a gel coat, but flow coat is like a top coat. It's like a It's a very, very top coat. Flow coat comes with the wax in it, where gel coat is not, and gel coat is generally mixed up for building up layers, whereas flow coat is more of a top coat. Other than that, that's the most differences that I know about gel coat and flow coat. But again, I'm not a professional fiberglass person. I don't do fiberglass every day. So Dwight says, is fairing filler different than Pookie or just a different type of Pookie? So Pookie, this is fiberglass saying that, this is something that I learned from someone else. It has nothing to do. I don't think this is like a national or world thing. It's a fairing filler is just a fairing filler that you fair out, whereas Pookie is colloidal silica or colloidal silica, and it's like for structural. So we call that Pookie, whereas fairing filler is just a fairing filler. There's not really a reason why we call it. That's just what the person that I learned a bunch of stuff from called it, and so that's what I call it. Ace Man, why so many hours on this one boat? Is this a side job that you are going to sell? Talking about building that bully netter. So many hours is just kind of what it is. And until you've actually ever rebuilt a boat or actually done a restoration project, which I think it's a very few number of people that has actually done, completed, and taken on an actual restoration or a rebuild of a boat. There's a lot of people out there that have, I bought an old boat, I detailed it, and I vacuumed the carpet, and I restored the boat. Like that's not really a restoration. And people like that don't really understand how much time it actually takes to do a restoration. And when I say a restoration, it doesn't have to be that you're doing fiberglass work and doing a transom, pulling the fuel tank and all that kind of stuff. Though, like on this one, the building of that bully netter, that's a 1970s boat that had holes in it, a 13-whaler where all the foam had to come out, the deck had to come out, had to have the transom redone. Like that's a complete rebuild of a boat, and it takes a lot of time. There is no getting around being able to do it in less time. It's if you want that boat to be done, which this is a boat that I wanted to do. It's not like you can go out and buy a bully netter. You have to make them. And so those kinds of lobster boats, you have to make them. They aren't you can't just go out and buy them. You have to make them. And that's just kind of what it goes into. Like when you build a boat, it takes a lot of time. And same thing with the restoration. If you are rewiring the boat and redoing the dash and redoing all the electronics and changing out the engine, and you are, taking off 15 years of neglect from the gel coat, it is a big undertaking. And usually it is easily into 100, 150, 200 plus hours to actually do a boat like that. Every boat's going to be different. Smaller boats are going to be able to be done in less time, but by and large, when you're doing a restoration project like that, it takes a lot of time. It's not just it took me 2-3 days to clean the boat, wet sand, compound, wax it, and, fix a switch and change the light bulb on the nav light, and now we're good to go. I did a service on the engine, and in 1 week you've restored a boat. Like it's generally a lot more than that. Those boats are gems. If you can find a good deal on a boat that just needs to be wet sanded, detailed, and have 2-3 pumps changed on it, and the engine doesn't need a lot of work, those are great when you can find them, but they're very far and few of those out there than there is the other side of a boat that's been sitting for 20 years that needs hundreds of hours of work to get it going again. Luke Alvarado says, what's your opinion on action craft boats and their transoms? Because I want to repower my 2002 18-foot action craft with a 150, but since the boat is a little old and is rated for a 140 horsepower max, I was wondering if it would be okay. So I like action crafts. I think action crafts are great. They ride great. They're a clean looking boat. They have a clean riding hull. I'm a fan of the action crafts. A 2002, I think it would be very, as far as a transom goes, The transoms always have to do with who's putting holes in the boat, because depending on who's working on the boat, what they have done to it, how many holes did they put in the boat, did they seal the holes, like what happened there, that's usually what happens when we start talking about transoms and needing to replace a transom. On a 2002, we're talking about, well, it's 2025 now, so we're talking about what, a 23-year-old. A transom shouldn't fail in 23 years unless someone's down there putting on a different transducer every 3 years and drilling holes for drain plugs, putting on ladders and, underwater lights and doing all kinds of stuff like that. Okay, now we're talking about what's happened to this transom, because it might have been sitting here leaking water for 20 years. Usually a transom failure, we're talking about a 30 to 40-year-old boat. And we're talking about boats that had wood transoms in the back. I don't think an action craft has a wood transom, but off the top of my head, I can't really say so. But even above that, like that's a normal discussion. When you're talking about, so for one, the rated power, if it's rated for 140, then legally that's all you can put on there. It's your boat. You can do whatever you want with it. That is like a legal thing that has to do with dealerships and legal liability. So if a boat is rated for 140 and you put a 150 on there and you take your boat out and you run somebody over in your boat, legally your boat is overpowered, it's unsafe to operate, and you are liable for running the person over. Like that's kind of more what that goes to. And then dealerships, like a boat dealership legally can't do that. If your boat's rated for 140, they're not going to put a 150 on there, because now all of a sudden they would be liable for that event if there was an accident and the boat is overpowered. Well, who put the engine on there? Well, this dealership put that in. Well, now that dealership is now liable for the damages because the boat was unsafe to operate because it was overpowered. All that being said, a 140 to a 150 is not like, you're not even going to be able to tell the difference there. I mean, honestly, there's going to be that transom ain't going to tell there's 10 more horsepower, and you'll probably be able to use the same propeller as your 140. So, in a realistic sense, your 23-year-old transom on the action craft should be able to hold an extra 10 horsepower. Your weight difference isn't going to be there's not going to be any change there, because a 140 and a 150 weigh virtually the same thing. Obviously, there's some variances between the brands, but weight-wise, no, and horsepower-wise, no. If you do it, it's on you for liability purposes, but outside of that, like unless you got a bunch of holes in that transom, I don't think you're going to have any trouble changing from a 140 to a 150 on a 23-year-old boat. Like that's that. Now, also on some of these boats, like some of the older stuff that have ratings on them, some older boats have ratings based on the engines that were available. So there are some boat brands that have a boat rated for, let's say it's rated for 300 because that was all that was out there. Whenever a 350 came out, they just re-rated the same boat. It's not like the boat builder changed anything about their boat just because a 350 became available and the 300 was only available before. They put the 350 on there. They check everything. Okay, it's good for a 350. Nothing changed with the boat. Just the available horsepower was now available. So there are some boat builders out there that have you can contact that manufacturer and say, hey, I have this year boat, this hull ID, and this is what I have on it, and I want to repower with this. Is that okay? And, you can get we never changed anything with that boat. So, yeah, that'd be okay. I don't know if they redo the plates, but it's worth a phone call to ask. Liuber Martinez says, hi, can you make a video or comment about Honda outboard reliability? Hondas are reliable. I don't know how much of a comment you really want, because I think Hondas are very reliable. I don't think they are as corrosion resistant as others are, but as far as reliability, it's a very reliable engine. I I don't have much comment outside of that. I can comment more on its corrosion resistance than I can about its reliability. But again, corrosion resistance is totally dependent on where you live. Like if you're on the fresh water, if you're up north in saltwater, cold saltwater, Honda's massive. If you look down in South Florida, Honda doesn't have that big of a presence down there because I don't really know why, honestly. I don't know why they don't have more of a presence and why they don't put more into their marine division, but we'll see. I think that Honda is hopefully doing more. I'm all for having more brands and more options, more opportunities out there when it comes to engines. But now last year, Honda got a deal with Scout and they were making their own boat. So kind of like, it seems like Honda, they came out with the BF350. So, I think they are starting to put more into it. So we'll see. I hope Honda does do more because when Honda's always been funny to me. If you look at anything else that Honda does, their cars, generators, lawn equipment, dirt bike, like anything else that Honda makes, it's like they're very, very good. So, I wish they would put more into the marine division, honestly. Ohio fishing. What about freshwater sinking? Sinking is bad regardless. Freshwater sinking, like we're talking about sinking a boat here. Like, if you're talking about sinking a boat, if you sink a boat in saltwater, it is 100 times worse on the boat than in freshwater, but it's still sinking and it is still very, very bad. For a freshwater sinking, you have to do all the same stuff that you have to do with for a saltwater sinking, but in general, it's not as bad as far as the engine itself. As long as you pickle the engine, which is just what people call getting the engine running, which is actually a lot easier than you would think. You basically just, depending on how bad the sinking was and for how long it was, immediately when you pull that engine out of the water, you want to drain all the oil, drain all of the water out of it, drain all the oil, drain all the fuel if water got into the fuel system. Sometimes it didn't, depending on the engine and the type of fuel system, but then immediately, drain your oil. Once you do that, then you want to put new oil in there and you are going to want to run the engine. And once you run the engine, then you want to drain the oil again and redo it and then run the engine another time. So you're going to want to run the engine for 4 or 5 hours to, one, burn off any water, and 2, get oil into all the oil passages, cleaning out all the water that's in there, and then 3, to just heat the engine up and let it run, let the bearings get soaked in oil and wear off any kind of water that could be in there, any kind of condensation, any of that. You're going to burn all that off by running it for, let's say 4 hours is good. Change the oil 2 to 3 times to get all that watery oil out of there, and then that engine's going to be fine. The problem is now the electrical components on there, because now every single one of those electrical components is compromised. It was underwater. You don't know the damage that was done. The engine computer, water getting into the computer, it works now. You did run the engine. All the electrical circuits got hot. All the water was dissolved, but whenever water evaporates, it leaves minerals and other things that were in the water behind, which start to create corrosion and other problems. So your computers might work today, and then 6 days from now, and all of a sudden the computer's doing something messed up because one of the circuits in the computer has corrosion and it's messed up. So, or you could get 10 years out of the computer and no problem. So they're definitely hit or miss, but freshwater sinking is, sinking a boat is bad. Like, it's just bad. Walish, can you touch on the importance of engine break-in and painting a boat for the first time with epoxy? How many layers do you guys use? So engine break-in is important. I mean, if you don't break in the engine properly, if you think about it, you have all of these metal components that are freshly machined. So you just have a complete engine that had drill bits drilling out passages, creating all the orifices and everything in the engine, all where the valves are seating, the piston rings, like everything is new. It is freshly machined. So the break-in is heating all that stuff up. And then whenever you heat metal up, it forms it, basically. I mean, it doesn't really form it, but it like, I guess forging might be the right word. Maybe that's the wrong word. Heating and cooling metal shapes it, basically. So whenever you break your engine in, all of your bearings and all of your rings and all that stuff, if there was a little piece of metal that is stuck on there where it didn't get completely shaved off on any component that could be inside the engine, when you break in the engine, that kind of stuff gets shaved off, and you have metal on metal contact where it creates little flakes of metal in your oil, and the oil catches it, puts it in the oil filter, and then boom, that's breaking it in. So how long does the break-in period last? Every manufacturer wants 10 hours. How they do it for the first hour, first 2 hours, next 8 hours is a different process. It's all pretty much the same. Basically, they want you to as minimal idle time as possible, and no wide open throttle more than 5 minutes at a time. No wide open throttle in the first 2 hours of the engine, and vary your RPMs every 15 minutes, basically. So that's virtually most break-in periods for most manufacturers. As far as the painting of the boat for the first time with epoxy, how many layers do you got? However many you want, really. I mean, like you want, and are we talking about, you're saying epoxy. I mean, are you talking, so an epoxy paint, how many layers do you want? 2, 3? I generally like 2 or 3. You've got 2 coats of primer usually, and then also say 2 to 3 coats of paint. That's generally what I would do, is 2 coats of epoxy. You would sand everything down the boat, spray it with your primer, come back, fair fill, all that kind of stuff, spray it again with the primer, sand it, come back, and then now hit it with your first layer of paint, second layer of paint, and then whether you want to do a third layer or not, that's kind of like up to you, but I would say at least 2 layers of paint. Muffins Bear says, it would seem to me that the complexity and expense of today's outboard engines would make a case for switching to an inboard engine, which would allow for more reliability and the ability to be maintained and repaired by owners. Inboard technology is just an extension of automotive technology. That's kind of goes back to our first topic, and to a point. Outboard technology is not that, to say that you can't maintain and repair your own engine is, you just aren't putting the work in to do it. Like to do a service on an outboard engine is extremely simple. I mean, they have laid it out to where it is very easy to do virtually any one of the engines that are out there. So I would say that that's not necessarily true. Anybody that can work on an inboard engine should be able to work on an outboard. I would say that they're the same. Now, depending on the repair, that's totally different, because some inboard, the technology on inboards is just as advanced as the outboard is. I mean, they're virtually the same thing, and a lot of them use the same sensors and the same stuff. So, as far as that goes, depending on the repair is going to depend on, what the problem is and how bad it is to diagnose. But I mean, if you start talking about O2 sensors and all this other stuff, like you kind of need you need a computer to do that stuff on a car too. I mean, automotive technologies, it's the same thing. You still need a computer to work on a lot of that stuff. Now, the days of a carburetor and being able to repair a carburetor, that's you don't get the fuel economy and like all the stuff that you enjoy and the features of the engine. You don't get that with simple stuff. Just like your automotive stuff, a completely decked out with the highest trim level of a car is going to be just as complex, if not more complex, than what you got in your boat. Now, the location is also going to play a big factor here as well, because if you've got an inboard engine in South Florida, say, like that's a bad idea. Like that's not the engine that you want to have down here. Very undesirable, very problematic. Takes a lot of time off the water because you're constantly dealing with corrosion issues, your risers, your manifolds, all that other stuff we talked about earlier. But anywhere else, it's fine. But I don't think a lot of people realize how, because you have a boating season. If you're from the north and your boating season is only 2-3 months out of the year, you're only putting a couple hundred hours on the boat in a year. You think that the affordability of an inboard engine is more desirable, but when you come down here and you can use your boat a lot more and it's in the water a lot and you start having the corrosion issues, you realize very quickly that it is way more expensive. Like some of these sport fish boats or some of these bigger boats, like the yachts and stuff, like they spend tens of thousands of dollars every year just on maintenance, like just to in the seacocks and the manifolds and the risers and the bellows and like all the stuff, the drive gear underneath, your propellers, the packing bearing, all this stuff that is constantly having to be changed, replaced, cleaned, and worked on. It's a lot of money. So, I think that's just it's something that you don't have any experience in. And until you get that experience, that's the way it seems. But that's my thoughts on that one. Mark Weebner says, which brand do you think is best against corrosion? Now, I don't think there is a best brand when it comes to corrosion. Corrosion is a problem regardless of the brand. I don't care what you got. I don't care if you got Mercury, Yamaha, Honda, Suzuki, a Tohatsu, a Hidea, a Parsun, a Hankai. Like, matters not what the brand is. If you live in a location with hot, calcium-filled, lime, mineral-filled water, salt water, corrosion is an issue regardless. It doesn't matter which ones do I think is the best. It's going to be Mercury, Yamaha. Hands down, those two are the best when it comes to fighting against corrosion, but it's still an issue. So there is no getting around corrosion. Like, you're going to have to deal with it. So the best, Mercury, Yamaha, they're the best when it comes to fighting against corrosion. Again, this is South Florida saltwater that I'm talking about. Boaters Hub. These podcasts are great. I like to listen as I drive around doing errands or listening as I am working. I have a question. It was slightly talked about in this podcast, but overpowering, let's say a boat is rated for 90 max on the sticker. Can the sticker be changed to up the horsepower a legal way, or what can be done? Boat can definitely take a 115 four-stroke. It's a Carolina skiff with a wide beam. Yeah, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where some manufacturers, I think you can do that. I don't know, like I was saying earlier, where you've got this model of boat is rated for this, and that's just what they had out there, where nothing changed about the boat, but now it's coming with a different engine. Like, if one manufacturer only puts X brand that makes a 140 and all the other brands make a 150, that boat's rated for a 140, even though a 150 is not going to be a difference. I would call the brand, call the manufacturer, because again, Carolina Skiff has been around for a very long time. They make the same boat for a very long time. So I would call them and see if they can do that. And then also, you can, if you modify your transom, if you beef it up, if you do stuff like that to make it take the engine, then legally, yes, you can do that with a, modified transom, where you have, a beam put in or whatever, you beefed it up. But legally, the only way to change that sticker is through the manufacturer. Like that is the only way. And I'm not for sure it's even possible, but I would definitely call, because I think you can, but it's case by case basis. And you got to talk to the builder of the boat. Like, you got to call Carolina Skiff and say, hey, I have this hen and I want to put this engine on there. Is it possible? What's the deal there? And they'll be able to better guide you in that, though. All right, one more question from 352 Maxwell. A topic I would like to be discussed is prop performance on boats. The performance between a prop that is reaching the minimum wide open throttle RPM and matching the same speed as a prop that is reaching the maximum wide open throttle RPM. Is that good or bad for the engine? How would that affect the performance at cruising? So, your bottom and your top wide open throttle range is usually only like 500 RPM. So 500-600, it depends on the manufacturer. Some are like 5 to 6, so some are 1,000 RPM. But if you are getting the same top speed with a prop that is getting 5,000 RPM and a prop that is getting 6,000 RPM, that 6,000 RPM is just a smaller prop, and Are we talking about a 4-blade? Are we talking about a 5? Talking about a 4-blade, a 3-blade? Are we talking about, different pitches, different, like there is so many things that go into a prop that it would take too long to discuss, and you would need a lot of visuals and examples in order to really dive into that. We have a couple of videos out there that kind of go over stuff like that. You've got your rake and you've got your pitch, you've got your diameter, you've got, a bunch of different stuff. Now, I think if you've got one prop that's reaching the same top speed and running 5,000 RPM, and you've got one that's reaching the same top speed at at the top end of the range at 6,000 RPM, this prop is just way smaller, or I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to envision that being a possibility. I just don't see there's information that's needed for that to be like that. Like generally you don't get 6,000 RPM and 5,000 RPM and have the same top speed. Usually the top speed changes somewhat. Like there's a difference there somewhere. Like, so that one's kind of difficult without more. We need more information to pile the variables in on why you're getting the same top end speed at 5,000 and 6,000 based on whatever the engine is. But if that's the case, I would say that at cruising speed, the bottom, the propeller that's getting you max wide open throttle at the same speed is going at cruising speed. Your engine is going to be way more loaded than with the other prop, which means the engine is going to be working harder, which most likely the one that's on the bottom is going to increase your fuel economy based on your cruising speed. If everything's the same and, we're cruising at this RPM at this speed, the one propeller that was on the lower is going to require more work to get to that, because topped out, it only got 5,000 RPM and got whatever speed you were. Cruising speed, that thing's going to have, it should technically have a, I was going to say it should have a higher RPM to maintain that same speed at cruising, but yeah, that would be right. So most likely that prop's going to burn more fuel. If I'm thinking about this correctly, I might be switched up here trying to run all this in my head, but yeah, one's going to be loading the engine more than the other one. So you're going to be losing fuel economy with one at cruising speed. But again, there's a lot of variables in here that you need data to run this kind of a situation. Discuss something like this. I've got a 300 horsepower engine, a 4,000 pound boat. I'm running a 4-blade, 17 pitch, 13 and a quarter diameter with a 15-degree rake, and then, I'm running a 3-blade, and I'm getting this RPM at this speed. Like, you need those numbers to have this discussion. You can't really have a prop performance discussion without the numbers, because propping is very, very number-based when you try to throw in the variables of what's going to be the difference. The difference is mainly going to be the loading of the engine and your fuel economy. That's going to be your two main differences there.